Hi, everybody. Welcome back. The second half of, excuse me. Welcome back. The second half of the lecture focuses more on the individual types of organisms found in Antarctica now that we've gone over some ecology basics in the first half of the lecture. So we talked a lot about krill. Let's actually see what they look like. Krill look like tiny little shrimp, and that's basically what they are. They are crustaceans. They are indeed related to crabs and shrimp. Crustaceans is the group that includes crabs, shrimp, lobsters, copepods like Sheldon plankton, barnacles, and on land they actually include pillbugs or roly-polies. Those are actually technically crustaceans, not insects. And krill are tiny, but there are millions of them present during the summer boom, and they can actually color the water orange, and whales and seals and other organisms that try to eat them can see that. So they are very, very rich in fat and protein, and they end up being an excellent food source if you can eat enough of them, which is why a lot of the organisms that have evolved to feed on them, like whales or the crab eater seal, kind of find a way to swallow a lot of them and filter the seawater out. And they're kind of amazing just in that there are so many of them. There may be more biomass of Antarctic krill than of any other organism on Earth, at least during the summer boom. So the last lecture slide had some information on phytoplankton, which are the producers or autotrophs of the Antarctic food web. And we are just here learning about the krill, which are the herbivores, or the herbivores of the Antarctic food web. Pretty much everything from this point is carnivores, things that feed on krill and the stuff above it. And there are other important there are lots of other what you'd consider carnivorous zooplankton in Antarctica too, but there's more krill than any of those. So we tend to focus on krill the most, also because of their importance for large whale species. Excuse me. Now, the fish in Antarctica are either going to be feeding on krill or feeding on other fish. So there are lots of different fish species around Antarctica, actually, but there's a few that have particular adaptations to the cold that I want to highlight here. So you might have heard about Antarctic icefish, and they're an oddity in that they dwell close to the seafloor and don't have a swim bladder. And a swim bladder is a feature that lets most fish adjust their buoyancy by inflating it to different degrees. It's not really clear why icefish don't have one, but they're not the only relatively deep sea organism to do it, and it may have something to do with the temperatures down there. They also unusually have very little hemoglobin in their blood, and hemoglobin is the compound it's the iron-based compound that binds oxygen to blood cells. So it's really not clear why they do this. Some people think it has to do with somehow it adapts them to the cold, but it's not clear what advantage it gives. But one thing they do produce that is definitely has evolved in response to the cold is they produce antifreeze, the same way that springtails on land do. And springtails, remember, are those little six-legged borderline microscope, or they're these little almost insects, like six-legged wingless arthropods that live on moss and use the glycerol proteins to avoid freezing in the winter. Icefish also have glycerol proteins in their blood. They evolved that convergently or separately. And there is actually another type of fish that has glycerol proteins also, the Antarctic toothfish, which is this lovely fellow down here. They're quite big. They are deep sea fish, and they also don't have a swim bladder. So that's what I meant when I mentioned that a lot of deep sea fish don't seem to have swim bladders. You can see actually how big the eyes are and how they point upward. That is also something you often see in deep sea fish. They're trying to see what little light they can, and if they're living at the bottom of the ocean, what little light is going to be up there. This fish is actually being hunted commercially increasingly. It is closely related to a species called the Patagonian toothfish, which is found in Argentina and actually lacks, well, the Patagonian toothfish has a swim bladder, lacks the glycerol proteins, and doesn't have the same, it doesn't live quite as long. Antarctic toothfish live a long time, and people think that's why their heartbeat is so slow. That may be an adaptation to deal with the cold, but they live a very long time. And one consequence of them living quite a while is that they are at risk of being overfished. The Antarctic toothfish are starting to be hunted now that the stocks of the Patagonian toothfish have been depleted a little bit, and there's concerns that that's going to deplete their population. They have the same problem that some sturgeons do, for example, and whales do. They don't breed they live a long time, and animals that live a long time don't breed very often, much of the time. But, oops, pardon me, didn't mean to do that. Going a bit up the food chain once again, we find that happily, dinosaurs do still live in Antarctica. Penguins had ancestors that lived with the last land mammals of Antarctica during the early part of the Cenozoic, and it's possible that there's fossils from the Mesozoic that look like penguins or that resemble penguin ancestors that may have lived alongside non-avian dinosaurs as well. So dinosaurs have had a really long presence on Antarctica. And penguins are truly marine birds. They do have to breed on land because they have to lay eggs on land, but they feed in the water, they play in the water, and they spend most of their time in the ocean if they can help it. They are really good swimmers, and that's really the reason they evolved flightlessness. They evolved flightlessness so that their wings could turn into flippers. Their feathers, as we'll find out, actually help streamline them and keep the water off. They can't fly, as we know, and they don't move very well on land, which is one reason they try to avoid being on land as much as possible. The interesting thing about penguins is that there's lots of interesting things about penguins, but I just do find it interesting how well adapted to living in the ocean they are, and how much the fact that they swim so well, but then are just so clumsy on land. It's very much like seals and sea lions. They're very much like the marine mammals they're very much like the couple of marine mammals that do still have to live on the land. The time they spend on land, they just look kind of clumsy, but they're really, really good swimmers. And they're really the most marine birds that ever existed, most likely. And really the most marine dinosaurs, probably, because remember that most of the marine reptiles that lived during the dinosaur age were not actually dinosaurs. Anyway, we have not flying dinosaurs, but we have flying dinosaurs in Antarctica. We have the petrels, probably the most. There's lots of different types of seabirds in Antarctica that feed on fish in the waters and sometimes breed in Antarctica, sometimes breed on the subantarctic islands. But one of the most prominent is the petrels, which includes the albatrosses, which are famous for flying really long distances, as well as the skuas, which are the scavengers / the pirates of the Antarctic skies. And we'll talk about them. And none of them really do spend much time on the mainland, though. Skuas do breed on the Antarctic mainland. I saw their nests on Ross Island, but they're in the Antarctic waters to catch fish. They're not that interested in what's actually happening on land. And that's one reason why we don't consider these to be land animals. Their food source is the ocean. So penguins are not just found in Antarctica, but they're associated with the continent because they're one of the larger animals that lives in Antarctica. They're fascinating, and there's a lot of different species that live in Antarctica. The emperor, the Adelie, the Chinstrap, the Gentoo, and the macaroni penguins all live and breed in Antarctica, and there's two more, the king penguin and the royal penguin, that live only on the subantarctic islands. You can also find penguins in South America, Africa, Australia, and New Zealand, aka former Gondwana. There is a single penguin that lives in the northern hemisphere, and that is the Galapagos penguin, shown here, which is one of the smaller penguin types. It is way, way, way smaller than the emperor penguin, which is by far the largest penguin species. And the penguin that comes to mind when people think penguins most frequently. The reason that the Galapagos penguin even can live so close to the equator is because of the cold ocean current. The Humboldt Current brings cold water by the Galapagos, and the Galapagos penguin is just fine with that. So penguins are able to stay warm through a combination of methods, which is pretty interesting to me, that it involves behavioral as well as physical evolutionary adaptations. Both their behavior and their physical form has evolved to help them keep warm. So if we focus on the emperor penguin in particular, let's focus on how big it is. why is it so big? And why does the biggest penguin of all live in Antarctica? In fact, the biggest penguin of all, said emperor penguin, is the only penguin that actually lays its eggs on the land, that actually that actually breeds like on the Antarctic mainland. It's the biggest penguin by far. It actually spends the winter. Actually, that's what I was trying to say. It's the only penguin that spends the winter in the interior at all, in the interior of Ross Island and on rookeries further inland from the coast. One reason why they do that actually is to avoid leopard seals, but it's a harsh place. The large size, as it turns out, actually helps. And this is one pattern we actually observe with how polar animals evolve. And it has to do with surface area. Because surface area matters, we're talking about the surface area of our skin, basically. Surface area matters because skin is what we're going to be losing heat through if you're a warm-blooded organism like a penguin or a human or a seal. And as it turns out, as a creature gets larger, the surface area of that creature is also going to get larger, but not at the same rate. The surface area is not going to get as large as the mass. The animal is going to get, say, 5 times larger. It's not going to have 5 times more surface area, and that's something you can show geometrically. So what this means is that in cold climates, getting larger can actually be quite efficient. Getting larger can actually help you lose heat less quickly. Getting larger can actually help you have less surface area relative to your body mass, and therefore less chances to lose heat. And that's really, really cool. And that's also why we see examples of large Arctic mammals in the Arctic. Polar bears are by far the largest bear species, and we have musk oxen and caribou, by far the largest deer species. Gigantism, polar gigantism, as you might call it, is something you see. So that's the large size of the emperor penguin is actually an adaptation to the cold. It's not a coincidence that the biggest penguin is the one that deals with the coldest temperatures, frankly. Now, it's not just the large size, though, because getting large is going to help, but it's not going to take you all the way. So penguins have a number of other evolutionary features that help them adapt to the cold. So the feathers are short and streamlined, and that, as I mentioned before, actually helps the penguin swim rapidly and keeps seawater from reaching their underneath, and it keeps wind from reaching them. So the feathers literally help keep the water off when they're swimming and keep the wind chill out when they're out on the land. And penguins have a layer of fat under their skin. They have a very thick layer of subcutaneous fat, which is not particularly common. That being so pronounced is not particularly common with birds. That's one way penguins are kind of interesting. And that gives them an extra layer of insulation. It's similar to how seals have blubber. Seals have fat that provides insulation that lets them swim in the Arctic and Antarctic oceans without freezing to death. Something else I find really interesting is that penguins don't just, I mentioned that their behavior has helped them adapt to the cold. And there's a couple ways that shows up. One of them is how they stand. Penguins can't really, so one way to avoid getting cold is to reduce contact with the ice. Do you remember Halley Station at all? The British station that was built on stilts? Well, that was done to reduce contact with the ice, and that's kind of like what penguins try to do. Ideally, you can stand on your tippy toes and not be touching the ice very much. Penguins can't stand on their tiptoes. They have webbed feet that don't do that very well. But what they do is the tip of their tail actually has feathers that don't have blood flowing to them and that are really stiff. And they can actually this is why penguins rock back and forward. It's an adaptation so that part of the time they're leaning on their stiff tail feathers, and part of the time they're leaning on their feet. They're kind of rolling so that first their toes and then the back of their foot and then their tail are touching the ice in succession, and then the back of their tail, the back of their feet, and then their tiptoes again. So they're kind of rocking back and forth to have it so that no one part of the bottom of their body is touching the ice for very long, which is a really cool adaptation. Huddling also, it turns out, helps them keep warm. Social behavior originating from societal necessity, essentially, which I think is kind of interesting. But penguins are warm-blooded, and the ones in the middle will stay warmer. What they do is they rotate the adults so that no one adult is on the edge for too long, and so that they can take turns being in and out. Of the specific types of penguin, the Adelie penguin is one of the two that breeds on the Antarctic continent. Now, it breeds in the peninsula and in the Ross Sea, and the schedule is actually synchronized with the Antarctic summer, which is another cool example of how life cycles of Antarctic animals have so heavily evolved around sea ice, which is kind of something you have to do if you're going to survive in Antarctica. The sea ice is just a fact of life, at least as long as humans don't pump enough CO2 into the atmosphere to warm it away, but that's another story. We will get there. Anyhow, they feed at the start of the summer, and then they migrate to their breeding grounds in October, which is start-ish of the summer. That's when I went to Antarctica, actually, in October. So they nest and rear either one or two eggs. These smaller penguins sometimes have two eggs. So they nest and rear their one eggs for about 3 months. They migrate again to feed in February when it's still light. February is still summer, but it's kind of getting into autumn at that point. They take advantage of that last burst of Antarctic summer productivity, and then in the winter, they migrate away. They migrate. They kind of follow the sea ice to the north to find open water. So Adelie penguins don't really overwinter on the Antarctic continent. They breed there in the summer, which is kind of interesting in showing that penguins, even though we think of them as the quintessential Antarctic animals, they don't really want to be on the Antarctic continent all that much, and especially during the winter. And the life cycle of these Adelie penguins is different from those of the emperor penguins. These folks breed during the summer and then get the hell out of Antarctica during the winter. Whereas the emperor penguin have adapted so that they actually breed during the winter. And we'll talk about this, but this is also kind of this is the subject of March of the Penguins. March of the Penguins focuses on why emperor penguins why they overwinter in Antarctica on the mainland or on Ross Island, because they're really the only species to do this. So their life cycle also ends up being highly synchronized. And their large size is ultimately an adaptation to help them survive overwintering in Antarctica. The large size, the huddling behavior, the subcutaneous fat all help keep them alive. Because their life cycle actually takes them so that they lay their eggs and watch them over the winter. So emperor penguins spend January through March feeding, and they do that because that's when ocean productivity is highest. Then they march hundreds of kilometers inland in some cases. Their rookeries are going to be a bit inland of the coast or on Ross Island, and it appears that the reason that emperor penguins evolved to do this is to avoid leopard seals and orcas, but leopard seals and orcas. They took the risk of adapting to live inland because even though there's no food for them inland, if they can find a way to get around that, there's nothing that's going to eat their babies. And that's really why they go inland. They go inland to find a safe place for their babies. And it's as safe as they can make it. You have tons and tons of penguins huddling, and that provides really a lot of the warmth needed for the babies to survive. So they migrate to the rookeries in April. They mate after they get to the rookeries, and after that, the female penguins make the trip back to feed. Because remember, this kind of makes it look like they're going on a gentle stroll away from the ocean, but they're going hundreds of kilometers. They're going a long way from the rookery to the ocean. And they're doing that to avoid predators, but it means that if they want food, they have to go somewhere and bring it back. And that's fundamentally what the female penguins are doing. They're feeding, they're restoring their fat reserves because they lose a lot of weight on the trip. They go through their fat reserves and they need to replenish those. While the female penguins have gone away to breed, male and female emperor penguins do form bonded pairs, and the males do play a large role in watching the babies. In particular, the males actually incubate the eggs for June and July, which is pretty rare even with birds. Male birds do often incubate eggs sometimes, but but it's still relatively rare for it to be this systemized. So that's an adaptation. That's an adaptation that helps penguins as a species survive. The male There's kind of a pouch in their feathers. Both male and female penguins have this, where that has evolved to help them cover the egg. So they incubate the eggs on the ice. They don't let the egg touch the ice. They're kind of keeping the ice between their legs in this pouch, and that's a very unusual situation for a bird. As we'll find out, most of the other penguins actually build their nests on the islands where there's actually rocks and soil and some plants. But emperor penguins have evolved to deal with this. The eggs will usually hatch in August. And remember, June, July, August is the dark polar winter. So it's very dark. But the female penguins have been out in the ocean eating fish, so they come back with their fat reserves replenished, and they also regurgitate food for the babies after the babies have hatched. And then it's time for the male penguins to go back to the ocean and feed. And they will swap and do this for the rest of the winter and into the spring. They will do this about 6 more times until the chicks are old enough to kind of start forming their own groups and stop being as dependent on the adults. So the penguin life cycle is really unique among birds, and it's a distinct adaptation to the Antarctic conditions, basically. And it's kind of amazing that they can survive like this, because Antarctica is an inhospitable place, but it's in their particular case, it's worth it for them to avoid the predators. They've found a way to safely breed inland and avoid predators, and also get as much food as possible during the summer. Not have to waste any time breeding during the summer. I mentioned that the other penguins generally breed on the subantarctic islands. So you do see these penguins around Antarctica, but you mostly see them there during the summer, and then they will breed on the subantarctic islands. So South Georgia, Kerguelen, the South Sandwich Islands, the Falkland Islands, which are not technically subantarctic islands, but they're close. But Gentoo penguins, for example, need to breed on ice-free surfaces. So they actually form their nests in grass. So not much grass in Antarctica, maybe a little bit on the peninsula, but their breeding grounds are mostly going to be on the subantarctic islands, where there's actually some plant cover. So you find their colonies on South Georgia and Kerguelen. Chinstrap penguins actually build their nests out of stones, and they live on many of these same islands. These are the chinstrap penguins over here, the ones with the black feather that gives them this little strap appearance. I found out that they are considered to be the most aggressive penguin species in Antarctica, apparently. They can be kind of mean. This fun fellow here, the macaroni penguin, that is apparently named from macaron, which is a name for these frilly shirts that European aristocratic men wore in the 17th century. So the sailors named them this. So it's named after frilly men's fashion, which I find kind of hilarious. But anyway, they are part of a group called the crested penguins. The crests exist in both the female and male penguins, so it may have to do with mating, but it may also be, it might somehow be an adaptation to the ocean swimming. But usually when birds have really prominent features like that, it's the male birds that display it for mating displays, but both male and female macaroni penguins have it, which is kind of interesting. But they also don't live on Antarctica itself. Or they don't breed on Antarctica itself. They have a habit of laying 2 eggs and only taking care of one of them, which is really bizarre. But this almost always happens with macaroni penguin colonies in particular. Now, speaking a little bit of the birds in Antarctica that can fly, we have the petrels. So the petrels are pretty magnificent. They include the group of they're a group of seabirds that include the albatrosses, and the albatrosses are some of the largest seabirds. They approach the size of some of the pterosaurs, some of the flying reptiles from the dinosaur era, and they take advantage of the sheer abundance of fish in Antarctica because it's so darn productive in the summer. They don't tend to breed in Antarctica outside of the peninsula. They the species of albatross that fly around Antarctica tend to feed in the waters and then fly to South Georgia or to the Falkland Islands or to Prince Edward Island or something a little bit farther away from Antarctica itself to breed, where they have a safer and slightly warmer place and slightly more vegetated place to build nests for their young. Albatrosses go long distances. Sometimes individuals have been documented circumnavigating Antarctica around the Southern Ocean a total of 3 times in a single year. That is a lot of distance for a bird. Albatrosses are mighty, mighty flyers. They have a relative, the skua, that are mighty, mighty pirates, basically. Skuas are infamous. That's this gray bird landing over here. But skuas are infamous because they steal food from humans. They, in the wild, survive by scavenging and by hunting baby penguins and seals. So they're another reason why emperor penguins want to have their babies inland, because the skuas are less likely to follow them inland and harass the babies, but they still come anyway. The leopard seals aren't going to follow them because they can't go that far, but, well, they usually can't, seal mummies aside. But the skuas will sometimes fly. They'll fly to the penguin colonies and try to prey on the babies. And they will also fly to human research bases. They are common at McMurdo, where they will steal food from you if you make the mistake of walking out of the cafeteria with it. They will eat garbage if the garbage is not properly bagged. And they have even named the lost and found at McMurdo base skua, because skuas steal everything and who knows where it ends up. That's kind of the joke. But they have been seen at South Pole Base. They are almost certainly flying there looking for human trash. And I saw one when I was in the dry valleys, which confused me because it was the first animal outside of the seal mummies I had seen in months. So I didn't see any penguins, but I saw one of these skuas flying around the dry valleys. And it was probably hoping that I would drop garbage for it also. No such luck. I avoided doing that, obviously, but they're waiting for human garbage. Speaking of now going on to the marine mammals, we don't have any land mammals surviving in Antarctica today, but we have many marine mammals like the pinnipeds. That's the group that includes seals and sea lions, as well as the Arctic walrus. The walrus is seals, sea lions, and the walrus are the 3 separate groups of pinnipeds. The walrus is the only living member of its group. We don't have walruses in the Antarctic. So if you see penguins and walruses, I'm trying to think. Yeah. There was Chilly Willy and Wally the Walrus in that Woody Woodpecker cartoon. Yeah, that's fake. You don't get penguins and walruses living in the same place. But you do get many other types of seals in Antarctica, and you get one species of the group that includes sea lions and eared seals. So seals are those pinnipeds that cannot. So they're when we say seal, we often also mean sea lion. Pinniped is the scientific group for the group that includes all of this. So pinnipeds that are true seals cannot flip their hind legs forward on land, as this skeletal drawing is kind of trying to show. If you look at a harbor seal, you'll kind of see that they just kind of drag their back legs behind them, and that's because they're kind of useless on land. They also don't have any visible ear flaps. So most Antarctic seals are part of that group. The harbor seals we have in California are part of that group, and so are Antarctic crab-eater seals, southern elephant seals, leopard seals, and pretty much all Antarctic pinnipeds. The one exception is the rather confusingly named Antarctic fur seal, which is this individual here. Notice that this one does have ear flaps. Notice that the back legs are actually flipped forward. It kind of looks like it can do a very awkward 4-legged walk on land. California sea lions can do this also. California sea lions are part of the group, the Otaridae. True seals are Phocidae. Sea lions are Otaridae. You don't need to remember those, but those are the actual scientific names. And the one example of that found in Antarctica is the Antarctic fur seal, which is also the largest pinniped found. They tend to be bigger. As you'll notice, California sea lions tend to be kind of huge. I will take a very brief diversion from Antarctica to make a note that over the weekend, I visited Carpinteria Bluffs Nature Preserve, and there's a harbor seal colony that lives in the beach near there, and they are breeding right now. You can see harbor seals out at the Carpinteria Bluffs. If one lives in Santa Barbara area still, that preserve is open, and that's a potential location you could use as the basis for a nature/geology hike right up. outside of the seals being there, there is some really interesting geology. This is a cool rock formation the seals happen to be sitting on. And if you're interested in, I can give you info on the geology, but if you're looking for something to do for extra credit that's not going to a talk, like if you're living in the Santa Barbara area and want to do an excursion, I'm cool with you doing one here because we talk about seals in this class. Those are harbor seals. Those are not the seals we have in Antarctica, but harbor seals and all other seals actually have the ability to use echolocation. It's something that the Antarctic seals use in particular because it's useful under the ice. And echolocation is when animals ping and they have sensory organs that can sense when that ping is coming back, the same way that human sonar works. Sonar receptors send a sound signal out and they register how it comes back, like what it's bouncing across. And that's what bats are doing when they open their mouths and make that little ping. They're sending sound signals out to look for insects. And likewise, seals will do this to look for the seafloor or for ice or for prey, for fish. They want to use echolocation to find signs that there might be fish nearby. They can see very well, and actually bats can see quite well too. Bats use a combination of their eyesight and echolocation. Seals have big beady eyes because they have evolved to see as much light as possible when they're swimming deep. And they can go a long way. Weddell seals have been calculated as staying at a depth of 1,500 feet for 3/4 of an hour, which is a long time. They can become negatively buoyant by constricting their capillaries and increasing the content of myoglobin in their muscles, which makes them denser and helps them sink. So it's kind of interesting how seals have evolved to be kind of like natural submarines. They can toy with their own buoyancy the way that we do with submarines. And once they're underwater, their lungs collapse and they store oxygen in their muscles. One really interesting thing about seal blood is that they've evolved, especially with Antarctic seals, they have evolved to have very high hemoglobin concentration. And that helps them store a lot of oxygen in their blood. It helps their bloodstream basically be a scuba tank for them. And how do seals even get around down there? Well, for one thing, echolocation, but if you're talking about where they go in the broader scheme of things, because seals do migrate, I mentioned how the seal mummies ended up in the dry valleys probably because they misread Earth's magnetic field, and that's because seals can read Earth's magnetic field. They have sensory organs that can sense magnetism. And this is how they move around the Antarctic seas, how they know more or less where they are and where their feeding grounds are, where ice holes are, because they need to find weak points to breathe. The really interesting thing about these two diagrams, these were two studies taken a couple years apart. The same seal was involved, and the same seal is covering a lot of the same territory. I mean, yes, differences, but the seals have a very good memory of where they go to surface, where they go to feed, where they go to breed, and a lot of that has to do with their understanding of the magnetic field, as long as they don't misread it and end up in the dry valleys. But as fascinating as I find those, let's not have more of those. One of the more interesting seals, I mean, they're all interesting, but an especially interesting adaptation is the teeth of the crab-eater seal. And most seals have sharp teeth that are evolved for snatching fish or squid, and crab-eater seals do sometimes do that also. But crab-eater seals have evolved these serrations that kind of give these teeth within a teeth effect, and it effectively functions as a sieve. It closes tightly enough so that they can swallow seawater and then close their mouth and expel the seawater through their teeth, but keep a good amount of krill behind. And that's actually what they're eating. That's why they're called crab-eater seals. Krill are not technically crabs, but they're close enough evolution-wise. And they are basically doing the same thing that whales do. They function more as a primary carnivore in that they're eating herbivores and less as a top predator like the leopard seal. Leopard seals actually do eat krill sometimes, which is interesting. They're a rather opportunistic top predator, but they're most famous for hunting penguins, especially baby penguins, hunting seabirds, hunting other seals even. They don't usually attack people, but they're not someone you want to jump in the water with either. And again, they are what the emperor penguins are trying to avoid. There's a reason Happy Feet had that really weird, bizarre scene with the leopard seal. They were trying to like be like, oh, this is what penguins are actually afraid of. They're huge also. They're some of the largest true seals in existence. As this thing gives for scale, I really do hope this person knew what they were doing when they were diving with leopard seals. I really do. The last marine mammal we'll talk about are the different types of whales that live in Antarctica. And there's two main types. They're two closely related groups that came from a common ancestor. The baleen whales, I'll start with the toothed whales, and those are dolphins and the orca and sperm whales and beaked whales, and those whales that still have actual teeth. Dolphins have teeth. Dolphins have teeth they use to catch fish. The other group, known as the baleen whales, have lost their teeth. Instead of having teeth in their mouth, they have hair growing in their mouth, or more accurately, baleen, which is a fibrous substance made of keratin. And keratin is a compound that makes up our fingernails, as well as hair. It makes up baleen too, and rhino horns also. That's the other example I was looking for. Rhino horns are not made of bone; they're made of keratin, the same material that makes up our fingernails and hair. And that keratin makes up the baleen in a whale's mouth. That material is fibrous and closely spaced enough to let seawater be pushed out when the whale wants, but to trap any krill that the whale has swallowed in. The whales have hair in their mouths to let them eat. So baleen whales include a lot of the really big famous whales that people go to Antarctica to see. And it's really interesting that the baleen whales are the largest. The baleen whales will swallow a patch of seawater in which they see krill swimming, and then they will close their mouth and expel the water through the baleen. The water makes it out, but the krill are too large and they get trapped by the baleen inside of the mouth. And this is how blue whales feed. The largest animal that has ever lived feeds this way, and so do humpback whales and minke whales and sei whales and all of the others. Again, they have very little surface area compared to their size. Them being so enormous actually means that they don't lose heat very rapidly, and they can sustain themselves on colossal amounts of krill. And you would think it wouldn't be enough food for them, but relatively speaking, being so big, they can subsist on just kind of eating enough krill, eating a lot of relatively low-calorie food. Good, lots of fat and protein, but not a lot of, but not a lot of them to begin with. They're eating plankton, but they can survive off that, which is really, really interesting. And baleen whales often migrate, as the humpback whales did in the example I showed earlier. The baleen whales will show up in Antarctica when the krill proliferate, and then they will go elsewhere to breed during the winter when there is fundamentally nothing to eat for them in Antarctica. The one toothed whale I'm going to focus on is the orca, which is really the top predator of the Antarctic ecosystem. The only other toothed whale that we really have in Antarctica is the sperm whale, and sperm whales kind of live everywhere. They live everywhere in the deep ocean. Orcas, which are also found in the Arctic. Orcas are found in both the Arctic and the Antarctic. They are very closely related to dolphins, and they're referred to as killer whales because they are very active predators. They will hunt penguins. They'll hunt seals. They are the only known predator of leopard seals, actually. They have very rarely attacked humans, which is good, but they will attack just about anything else. And there are usually not going to be that many of them in a given area because they are eating very high on the food chain. There are not going to be enough seals to support a huge number of orca, even though in a place like Antarctica where there is a lot of primary productivity during the summer, there's still going to be quite a few of them. And the orca are also known to migrate on a small scale, although they will kind of eat anything, so they, to a big extent, survive the winter by just finding whatever is still around, whether it's seals, penguins, or whatnot. And the interesting thing about whales is that they spend their entire life in the ocean. Whales are the one group of mammal that have evolved to breed out at sea. And it's not that surprising that whales have managed to make it to Antarctica in that sense. The whales that live in Antarctica today didn't first evolve in Antarctica. Whales evolved actually in what's now Pakistan, most likely in that area. That's where they find the earliest fossils. But whales spread worldwide, and they were able to take advantage. They were able to show up in Antarctica and take advantage of the fact that there is still a lot of marine biodiversity in Antarctica, and thus a lot to eat from their perspective, even though there's not much on the land for land mammals. And that's it for new material for the first half of the class. So if you've gotten through this, congratulations. Good job on getting through this. and good luck studying for the exam. I'm again sorry it took me so long to put these up.